learning process. So please share the highlights of the session on your social media and remember to tag us at the accounts you should be seeing on your screen right now. And remember to use the hashtag GYC, Global Youth Coalition, and Global Youth Training 2023. Starting off, you're going to see the accounts in a second. There you go. So please remember to use these accounts. My name is Mirna, and I'm going to be one of your facilitators for today's session. Some of you might have seen me before in a session or two, and I'm super excited to be here again. I'm volunteering at the Global Youth Coalition, and I'm also doing my master's right now in international relations and how they affect climate negotiations at the Central European University in Vienna. But I'm only one of the facilitators for today, so I'll leave it to the gorgeous Gaia to introduce herself.
I am so sorry, everybody. I had my computer just froze and I wasn't able to speak. Thank you so much, Marina, for your introduction. And my name is Gaia, and I am also working on this training through Oxford Net Zero. And I'm currently doing my master's in anthropology, looking at the relationship between health and environment. I am beyond excited for the session today. There will be some amazing speakers lined up for you, touching on really important themes that some of these themes are arguably not really spoken about enough in debates about climate change. I'm also going to note that there is a little technical issues. That's why the slides that you see are not perfect right now, but we are working to sort it. So we're going to be back in a second. In the meantime, I'm just going to let Myrna introduce a bit more about today's session.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, today's session is going to be about gender and climate change. And generally, there are a lot of really obvious things that come to mind when we think of climate change, such as food insecurity, water scarcity, displacement, etc. And gender isn't usually one of those things that pop up for many people, but it really should be. Climate change is a multiplier of existing health vulnerabilities and gender inequalities, and it has a disproportionate impact on women and girls specifically, from increasing the chances of them being subject to sexual exploitation or gender-based violence, or reducing their access to resources such as reproductive healthcare systems. The climate crisis is not gender blind, and that's what we're going to be discussing in today's session.
We really hope that today's session will provide you with an overview of these complex interlocking factors that influence the relationship between gender inequities and climate breakdown. But also, and really importantly, we also are confident that our speakers will show you existing initiatives that are already making a real impact in this regard, and hopefully inspire you to take action too, because the climate crisis needs solutions that are truly intersectional. So I'm just going to check whether we are ready to share the slides again. 1 second, and I'll be ready to go on with our presentation today. Yes, there we go. Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the technical support that we have here at Oxford from Smith School as well, because yeah, you may see some little difficulties, but there is a huge organization behind this. And sometimes things do not go as planned, but it's still great to have the possibility to do so. Okay, so these were us. Right, so we got an amazing lineup, as I was saying before. We got Natalie, Sifuma, Dr. Farhana, Sultana, Thazin, Aung, and Reetika, Subramanian. Just a couple of words about the agenda, which will be next slide. As always, we have a 5 minutes Q&A after each speaker's intervention, and then in the middle of the session there is a break. So make sure that you're comfortable and do not worry too much about the attendance form and other things like that. We're going to share the due course, so please relax and enjoy this session. Something else that I wanted to mention is that there will be a link to a note sharing document, because we have implemented this in the past couple of sessions, and it's worked really well. So now you can see it in the screen. You can either focus on, you can either take the QR code, or you can also follow the link that we just shared in the chat, and you will be taken to a shared Google Doc where you'll be able to take notes and share what the key takeaways from these presentations that you hear today will be. You can also comment on people's and other participants' ideas and notes. So it's just our way to sort of build up our common capacity, a youth capacity, and sort of like sharing our position on these important issues. So without further ado, I am now going to introduce our very first speaker. Just changing the slide now. We're really, really happy to have here Natalie Sifuma from the She Changes Climate campaign that will give an overview on the amazing work that this organization is doing. Natalie is a storyteller and communications professional, inspired and fueled by the fundamental role of African women in society and around the world. Her professional journey has been guided by this, and in more than 8 years of experience, she has worked on development and creative communication projects that have highlighted and amplified women's narratives in health, education, culture, and climate action. She's currently the head of communications at She Changes Climate, a global movement at the nexus of gender and climate, championing for more diversity and inclusion of voices in climate leadership and decision making. Welcome, Natalie. Thank you so much for being with us today. Before I leave the floor to you, I just wanted to remind all participants to ask questions to Natalie that she will have the chance to answer after the presentation. You can go on Menti and use the code that you see here, and it's going to also be shared in the chat in a second. And yeah, as you hear the presentation, you're welcome to share your curiosities and questions that we will ask to Natalie afterwards. The floor is yours. Thank you so much, Natalie. You're welcome to share your presentation now.
Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are, even good morning. Happy to be here as a representative of She Changes Climate. So I will just share my screen. All right. All right, so my name is Natalie Sifuma. I always like to start with a story. My name is Natalie Sifuma. I am a Kenyan communications professional, as you've heard, and I am deeply, deeply passionate about stories. So I've had a bit of time to explore the creative side of communication and just see how important messaging is, especially if you are targeting specific people for specific things. And of course, in this context, we will be looking into how, sort of the communication side of climate and gender advocacy work, which is the heart of She Changes Climate. So a bit of background about She Changes Climate. We come from a place of seeing the gaps that lie in, especially in climate leadership, but then also seeing what's actually happening on the ground, what's happening because of climate disasters. And so a few key facts to start us off are that women represent more than half of the world's population. That's a fact. Women are 14 times more likely to die during an extreme weather event. And just last year, 80% of climate refugees were women. And then when we look at climate leadership, more specifically COP, which is the annual climate summit, since the first COP in 1995, only 5 women have been appointed as COP presidents. And then in 28 years, or let's say 27 years, last year being COP 27, the gender balance across all party delegations was clearly, there was a gap there. 36% of delegates were women and 64 were male. And yet, going back to what's happening on the ground in different parts of the world, women are more affected. So having understood these challenges and these gaps, it was really about creating a pathway to a solution. And our theory of change was really just about seeing what is the challenge. The challenge is that women are the ones who are most affected. And yet when it comes to policy and advocacy side of things, women's voices are underrepresented. And when we look at the definition of women, we realize that it's very easy for certain groups of people or groups of women to be left behind. And so for us, it's about understanding that women come in forms of diversity. And so women in all their diversity who are active contributors to the well-being of our society, of our planet. And so they should be part of the solution to addressing the climate crisis. So our theory of change is based on the ability to scale up positive impacts by working, in tandem. So we are doing policy and advocacy work, but then we're also doing bottom-up mobilization and grassroots movement and building. So just to expand on those three aspects or those pillars and our ways of working is that we are looking at the leadership crisis. We're looking at the climate crisis as a leadership crisis. And so we are really going headstrong on advocacy work. So influencing climate policy and asking country delegations to have gender parity on their COP teams. So this really just looks like speaking with decision makers, speaking with some diplomats, really just getting the conversation going in these leadership rooms. Secondly, we're also doing a lot of public campaigning. So She Changes Climate started 2 years ago, and it was out of frustration that the COP26 leadership lacked women. And so it became a campaign where it was just social media messaging and just telling people that clearly there's a gender gap in leadership, and yet climate is affecting women. And so it was using targeted messaging and truthful messaging at that, and using stories which are at the heart of driving social change to rally people. And so between COP26 and this year now, as we speak, we've been able to rally over 20,000 people in Europe alone. And we are now also getting our footing in parts of Africa, like South Africa and Kenya, to say the least. So that's a second aspect of what we do. And then finally, this is an area that we are now diving into, is women empowerment or women amplification in the global South. So looking at the challenges that various women who show potential to be leaders or who are leading various programs in their communities can be amplified, how their voices, their stories can reach the decision makers in those advocacy spaces and rooms that we are getting into. So you can see how these pillars sort of, work and align together. And it's really been an exciting and a journey of learning, but then also based on happenings, current happenings, we're constantly refining things like messaging for public campaigning. So for instance, how we campaign in the UK will be very different from how we campaign in Kenya, for instance, or how we campaign in India. So it's ensuring that the work that we're doing reaches as many people as possible in a way that they understand that they are very much part of the She Changes Climate movement. So really just going back to those statistics, this is one of the images that She Changes, that has been a defining factor of She Changes Climate, and that is that climate change affects the whole world, not half of it. And that's really just to show that when it comes to decisions and decisions being made around climate policies and climate action, that we need to include representatives of the different genders that we have. Now, one of the achievements from last year, if I could get into that just briefly, is that we were able to come up with a She Changes Climate film, and that has also helped us in, strengthening our reach and the people who understand this campaign and want to be part of it. But now, just looking ahead, since we are in 2023 and COP28 is just around the corner, it's important to know that it will be held in the UAE, which, for those who are conversant with climate conversations, there has been a lot of friction around that, because the UAE is one of the largest, is perhaps the largest producer of oil around the world, and we are, having conversations around fossil fuels globally. But our policy work, which is the top-down advocacy on the inside and bottom-up mobilization, is that we are having conversations with the high-level champions of COP28, but then we are also having conversations with other decision makers representatives of countries and organizations in different, sort of parts of the world. And as we head into COP, some of the things that we are planning on doing is having a multi-stakeholder dialogue at COP or outside COP. And we have gotten a couple of countries from different regions who are expressing interest. So that's quite positive because it gives us an opportunity to share this important note around, the representation of women. And then we also have an online summit that's coming up. And the reason for the online summit is really just to get as many people involved in the conversation around gender and climate at COP and even beyond COP. So what does the future of COP look like when we have perhaps co-shared leadership, a man and a woman leading together because they both bring different strengths?
I think that Natalie's internet must have dropped right now, so sorry about that. We think that like the second that she will jump on, maybe we can ask her some of the questions that we already gathered from the few minutes that she managed to deliver the presentation for. So I think that we can maybe carry on to our next speaker until we know that Natalie is back on. And as always, you're welcome to use the Menti with the code that you see on the screen right now to keep asking questions to Natalie, because she was already saying some very, very interesting facts about the work the organization is doing. So maybe, yes, we can carry on. Myrna, up to you.
Yes, okay. So I'm sure I already saw some very interesting questions for Natalie. So we'll get to those in a second. But for now, our next speaker on today's amazing lineup is Dr. Farhana Sultana. Dr. Farhana is a professor in the Department of Geography and Environment in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, where she's also the research director for Environmental Collaboration and Conflicts Program. Dr. Sultana is an internationally recognized and award-winning interdisciplinary scholar of political ecology, water governance, and transnational feminism. She's an author of several dozen publications. Her research and scholar activism draw from her experiences of having lived and worked on 3 continents, as well as from her background in the natural sciences, social sciences, and policy experience. Prior to joining Syracuse, she taught at King's College London and worked in the United Nations Development Program. She was awarded the Glendale Laws Award from the American Association of Geographers for outstanding contributions to geographic research on social issues in 2019. Dr. Farhana will be talking us through feminist climate justice and intersectionality in the climate sphere. Please go ahead, Dr. Farhana.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And welcome, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I want to talk through some slides fairly quickly, but I'm happy to answer questions thereafter. So what I want to talk about today is climate justice in terms of, we know that in light of growing global concerns over climate breakdown and recently published IPCC reports, we are seeing exacerbating vulnerabilities across the world, especially in marginalized communities. And we noticed that even this past weekend with the climate rallies and marches around the world, we're seeing more and more demands that we take critical climate justice more seriously, and not just globally, but then also locally. So how did we get here, and why should this matter, and why is this a feminist issue, or why should we care about undertaking a feminist analysis? And the argument I want to put forth is this. So let me first just briefly discuss, why it is an issue, and then move on to in what ways can we understand this issue better. So the context is, as many of you already are familiar with, is that climatic disasters have become more profound in recent years, and there's greater attention given to these issues, especially as we've seen that lots of different kinds of suffering has been occurring around the world, and that a climate justice framework could hopefully help us understand what's happening. So what do we mean by climate justice? What that does is it shifts the analytical gaze away from just understanding climate change as a scientific phenomenon to understanding climate change as more an ethical and justice issue. So therefore, climate breakdown is not just a science or techno-managerialistic issue, but climate justice asks us to have these conversations beyond the science and the finance and the technology of climate to understand the social impacts of climate change, and then also the impacts of the solutions that are being put forward. So we know that climate change is a threat multiplier, and climate justice fundamentally is about paying attention to working with and addressing how climate change impacts people differently, unevenly, and disproportionately, and also how those resultant injustices can be redressed in fair and equitable ways to reduce any further marginalization or exploitation and oppression. So we therefore know right now that climate change is a political issue. It has been for some time, but it has historically not been understood that way. And applying a climate justice approach is an intentional process that involves carefully analyzing who is being left out or marginalized by both climate change itself and any adaptation or mitigation interventions, but also who is talking about climate change, who gets asked to talk about climate change. So when we think about climate justice, we not only investigate who benefits, who loses out, in what ways, where, and why, but we recognize that it is an explanatory tool that helps us understand wider relationships across different scales or levels, but then also what it means to think about creating justice with many different participants. And even though climate science has told us that there's unequal and uneven events and therefore burdens across the world, so even if we call climate change a planetary crisis, there is a common but differentiated responsibility to tackle it. Communities that have contributed the least to climate breakdown are actually the ones who have been unduly burdened and harmed for decades, and that historical and geographical difference highlights and is brought to the forefront when we talk about climate justice and not just climate change. So again, it is that shifting in analytic to bring in equity considerations and figuring out how do we reduce and remove harms, and what are our commitments to climate justice that is about political action and solidarity, but at the same time, recognizing that this just does not mean society entirely understood as a homogeneous whole, but that critical climate justice perspective asks us, what are the ways that different groups of people are impacted, and what are the different bodies of scholarship and social movements and indigenous and local wisdom that we can draw on to better understand and address those concerns around equity and fairness or climate reparations. So fundamentally, when we think about climate justice, we're talking about power relations and power structures and inequities that occur across different places, but also across different institutions, and thinking about how other issues get caught up or embroiled in climate change, such as globalization, international development, trade, and so on. So this brings me to understanding why we need to better understand gender intersectionality and the relations to climate change. One issue that has come up repeatedly over the years is that climate justice efforts cannot be equitable or effective if we don't really draw on what feminists and other scholars have taught us, or various perspectives from around the world in arguing for what a feminist understanding of climate justice could mean. And what feminist scholarship reveals is that we're also having to bring in other forms of knowledge and insight, such as from anti-racist, anti-colonial, decolonial, and anti-capitalist scholarship to better understand what we mean by justice. So when we think back to how did this all start, we can actually think back to even the Bali Conference of Parties, or COP, many, many years ago, when feminists rallied to say, no climate justice without gender justice. And what these social movements and activists argued were that women have historically been at the forefront of the climate justice movement, and that they're raising awareness across the world about the gendered harms and burdens that are inequitable. So when we think about intersectionality, what this means is looking at different axes of oppression and how these lock together in terms of why is it that certain groups of people, when they're simultaneously experiencing sexism, but also, let's say, classism or racism, ableism, and so on, are disproportionately harmed, but in different ways. For instance, if we think about water scarcity, this often means that women and girls are spending more time and labor fetching water around the world. And what feminist justice scholarship does is it brings forth the intersectionality of who these people are and why, and how do we understand patriarchy. So patriarchy is that system that tends to oppress people by their gender identity, based on a historical notion of masculine control of the economy, of societal decision-making, and political power. But we also need to understand that we should never essentialize men and women into binary categories, but intersectionality asks us to still disaggregate patriarchy, to look at the intersecting oppressions that occur across gender, race, class, ability, sexuality, and so on. So what we do get is a much more complex view of gender in terms of the various risks, the responsibilities and rights that exist, and therefore we can start to account for them. So when we integrate feminist insights into climate justice scholarship, we're able to have more inclusive planning beyond the techno-managerialistic climate solutions. We can strengthen women's movements for strategic activism, for advocacy, for capacity building, for network and resource access. But it also documents differently positioned women and their lived experiences and helps us elevate different voices so that we can understand in more nuanced ways, what do we mean by climate justice? And what I want to stress is that it is not just analytical or scholarly insights that help us get these tools, but also recognizing that it comes from social movements, from praxis-based feminist traditions, from local wisdom, and that we need to understand what these mean in different contexts. So there can be similarities and differences between groups of people across the world, but there can also be patterns that exist, and we can start to see what kinds of shortcomings need to be systematically addressed, what kind of policy failures exist that do not address equitable solutions because they were not bringing in the specific analytical tools that feminist insights demand of us. So the goal becomes to elevate not just a range of voices of variously marginalized populations, but also demanding that people in power, in different corridors of power, are also analyzed, and they're therefore challenged to recognize where the shortcomings are. But a caveat is that to understand that feminism is not some magic bullet, that, you know, for instance, we're going to still see the need for various types of other forms of analysis, but I want to stress that public policy is only strengthened when we have much more insights in understanding what we mean by a feminist climate justice in terms of legal instruments, policy documents, planning imperatives, and also implementation. So what feminist understandings do is they provide a roadmap for analysis, for advocacy, and for action, so that we can start to address these big challenges where climate threat multipliers are promoting various forms of harm that we may not even know about. And we can counteract that to promote more fairness and health and well-being, not just for individuals, but society overall. So I want to conclude by thinking about, well, what can we do, or what do we mean by moving towards a feminist climate justice? So we know that at the international levels, activism already exists for climate justice and that new challenges are emerging. But we also learned from the COVID-19 pandemic that it is very possible for governments, for institutions and citizens to actually respond very quickly if we need to. But on climate change, the response has been historically quite slow. So for instance, for decades, if countries in the global south or small island nation states were raising the alarm bells, countries that were powerful and in the global north, such as advanced industrialized countries, did not necessarily heed those warnings or respond with trying to mitigate climate greenhouse gas emissions. What we can also think about is how aid organizations or international development groups or nonprofits are also increasingly taking climate justice into their consideration for funding priorities and interventions, even if governments may be slow to act. But we know that governments are finally beginning to act in the last few years in terms of providing more climate finance and having different institutions and different bodies figure out how to allocate those and what to do with them. So those collaborations between state and non-state actors need to be equitable if we think about climate justice and feminist climate justice. And we can start to shift the practices and not just theorizations, but also what do we mean by the implementation part? We can think about how, for instance, international negotiations are quite difficult around climate reparations because there's so little accounting for historical and contemporary global emissions and accountability. But at the same time, we can still work on the ground in trying to do what we can with what we have where we are, and recognizing that all interventions need to be continually reassessed. So one way that feminists have started to talk about this is, well, historically, we've had a very extractive economy. How do we think about moving towards a regenerative economy? Could we think about climate finance that moves aid away from extractive industries to more, rejuvenating agriculture, agroecology, towards different kinds of supporting women's groups, gender minorities, youth groups, and so on. But then also think about mobility justice for climate migrants. And how do we increase decarbonization? How do we bring down emissions rapidly? Who will it harm? Who will it help? And how do we do this? Those are the kinds of questions that feminist climate justice activists and scholars are paying attention to. Why do we keep thinking that endless economic growth on a finite planet is even possible? It is not. So perhaps we need to shift our attention to sufficiency, to commoning, to care, and not just neoliberal growth and increasing number of billionaires who are extractive and capitalist and alienating. But think about the ways that we can lift people up from the bottom. Solutions that are gender sensitive, solutions that are race sensitive, solutions that are class sensitive, and recognize that intersectionality is critically important to this. One way to approach this is to demand better data collection, better planning. So how can we do multi-scalar gender disaggregated data collection so that we can monitor, have accountability, develop adequate capacity, and have adequate budgetary resources from governments? So without that kind of knowledge and information, or even knowing how to design our policies, designing our studies, designing our data collection, we are going to collect the wrong data and offer the wrong solutions. And this is why it is so critically important that anyone involved in climate justice work or activism continually educate themselves, find resources that you can read and learn from so that your own endeavors are sharper and more equitable and therefore more aligned with what people actually need. So one example I can give is, for instance, people tend to focus on domestic solutions or what is happening in their own country, which is great. You start small, you start local, but recognize those international connections as well, right? Because there can be connections between places and issues. Could we learn from other places? Could we leapfrog and build another form of alliances? Could at the same time, we better implement what we're doing and improve our own understanding and our approach, because perhaps what we were doing in the long term is not actually beneficial. So reframing climate debates with those insights from various feminist insights and solidarity movements can help us unearth those root causes and therefore redress them. So we don't just rush to quick fix solutions, but we start to confront issues that cause harm, such as patriarchy, whether they exist in the community, in the institution, or in how policies are designed. It's because it is not just in interpersonal relationships, it's in how we discursively frame an issue, and then the solutions we allocate to it and the budgets we therefore roll out. And this means we have to be critically reflexive. We need to be reflexive of ourselves, who we are, what we're doing, take stock. It is that continual taking stock and working with different groups and organizations and recognizing that students and young people have power, but they also need to continually re-educate themselves so that they better understand and are able to learn from the wisdom of elders, from indigenous communities, from various agrarian communities, but then also in terms of how is policy made. You need to learn the discourse and the language of power holders so that you can intervene in those kinds of debates. So what I want to do is basically just conclude my talk with saying that what a feminist climate justice framing does is it encourages policymakers and citizens to approach climate change in more comprehensive ways. It calls for an accountability of intersectional analysis so that we can take into account lived experiences and wisdom of differently situated subjects, and at the same time fine-tune and continually improve our own approaches and our own policymaking, but then also our own interventions. What are we fighting for? So instead of just cliches or very thin analysis, we're able to do that much more deep and meaningful work. And advancing a critical feminist climate justice work means that meaningful and inclusive way to recognize and reduce intersectional harms, and at the same time, recognize our own limitations, work with others to reduce both our and everyone else's burdens and sufferings, but at the same time, finally, recognize that systemic injustices overlap and systemic change requires that collectivized, concerted action, but then also ensuring that it is not only us who speak and we do not pursue one-size-fits-all solutions, but we learn from various constituents, and sometimes we decenter ourselves so that we're able to learn from others. So I'll end there, and thank you for listening. And if you'd like to learn more about my research or my talks and publications, you can access them from my website, which is my name, farhanasultana.com, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sultana. This was amazing. It was brilliant. And it's so nice to have scholars such as yourself and everyone on this panel who are discussing climate justice and really taking the lead and initiative on this. I'm going to read out some questions from our viewers now, starting with Professor Sultana. Do you think climate justice issues have been incorporated into the global stocktake process? If yes, how so? And if no, how so?
Integrated into what processes? I didn't hear the last part.
The global stocktake process.
I'm not entirely sure. I think some parts have and others not so well. But we also have to recognize that climate justice has unfortunately become one of those signifiers. They have become a buzzword, a term that people kind of throw around. So this is what I want everyone to do, to ask these kinds of questions, investigate what do you mean by climate justice? What are the specificities? What is the analytical framework you're bringing to it? How do we do this? What do we understand by it? Because we can't say maybe it's been integrated, but where and by whom and what does it do? Because there's so many buzzwords and empty meanings. I think we need to be really cautious, but at the same time celebrate the fact that people are moving towards more understanding of climate justice and not just climate change.
Completely. The second question is, do you believe it will be possible to change patriarchal structures from within? How can we englobate more intersectional feminist ideas within existing power structures without losing their radical force?
All right, so that's a two-parted question, and I'm not entirely sure I can remember the second half because I'm not seeing the written question. It would be easier if I had them written in front of me. But in terms of patriarchy within, yes, absolutely. Patriarchy cannot be changed from just the outside. It can only be changed from within in terms of how are the ways that people are learning about patriarchy and who's doing the challenging. So when we talk about patriarchal change, often the burden falls on women or those who are identifying as women or gender minorities, but it should actually be also men or people who identify as men or people who hold different kinds of power, positions of power or authority. We cannot expect people who are being oppressed to challenge their oppression entirely. So that's what I mean by it is bottom up. But when I mean by not entirely externally, what I mean by that is someone from the outside cannot come and tell your community, you're patriarchal, you need to change. You need to work with people to say, here are the ways that we're seeing and witnessing how patriarchy is operating. So one example is just the way people dress does not mean women are liberated. Your clothing does not mean you're liberated. Patriarchy can show up around economic decision-making, banking, who gets a loan, who doesn't? Are you paid 70 cents to the dollar, right? So your earning capacity over a lifetime. So people often think, well, women are wearing whatever they want, so we have no more patriarchy. That's absolute nonsense, right? That means perhaps clothing liberation has occurred, but wider patriarchal justice has not been achieved because we're still seeing systematic oppression of intersectional harms of, let's say, women of color or Black women or Indigenous women being paid less, of not being hired, of not being retained, of not being promoted in the workplace. That is patriarchy institutionally. And what was the second part of the question?
The second part of the question was, how can we englobate more intersectional feminist ideas within existing power structures without losing their radical force? And I'll be posting the questions on the chat also. Okay.
So it depends on what you mean by radical force. So if we're talking about more radical movements who are not taking account of patriarchy, then they're not really that radical in my mind because they're missing out on very important ways that it can cause harm. Having said that, however, yes, there are many instances where patriarchy is not the highlight and gender oppression is not the main focus because people are much more interested in, let's say, bringing in attention to a certain issue and everyone is coalescing or collectivizing around, let's say, protecting a homeland or, challenging a certain kind of dispossession or water poisoning. That's collective action. But internally, the groups should do group reflexive exercises to understand who is actually doing the speaking, who is getting the voice, who is being promoted to have that voice. But then at the same time, recognize that what is it that they're fighting against? Is it a form kind of racialized dispossession? Because racialization also works hand in hand with patriarchal dispossession. So tease those out, understand that better. And this is what I mean by the constant re-education. So unless we understand what these words mean, we don't have the tools in our minds to go looking for where the problems might be. And, and therefore we're not as powerful as we could be in the kind of solidarity action that we undertake.
Thank you so much. And the final question is, where do we start if we want to spotlight climate justice at the policy level? And do you have any extra readings recommended about feminist climate justice?
Yes. So where do you start? Start with what you have from where you are today, and then do better tomorrow. That's what I tell my students all the time. But you should also recognize that to do better tomorrow and the next week and the next month means we do have to start educating ourselves. We need to listen to other people. This is an educational exercise, right? Somebody asked about readings. I'm happy to share some. You're welcome to, read some of my material. But then there's also other kinds of work that happens all the time. For instance, if you want to start small and start locally, recognize that maybe what we're doing locally isn't always the best or always the most helpful because we just didn't know. Maybe we didn't know. And we need to go learn from another different locality or a different organization. And that helps us improve. But we're still rooted in the local or the regional or within our movement. But what we're doing is we're networking and we're learning from each other, but we're also learning from things that are not called movements. And that's what I mean by academic knowledge, because academics have the luxury of producing knowledge with different constituents. Activist groups do not always have that time, but you can maybe take out a little bit of time and say, okay, we're going to collectively read this. We're going to allocate 1 hour, or we're going to watch this talk. So what you're doing is you're reflecting and learning and incorporating that to what you're doing on the ground at that point in time, and then trying to figure out how do you do better. So I think that was the question, right? Like how, where to start. But at the same time, some people start big. Some people ally with others and say, okay, we're going to go and do this protest and draw an attention, and it is on the steps of the US government. That may feel small, but it's a question of, are you getting media attention? Can you ramp up? Can you escalate that attention and bring more people into these kinds of conversations? And what was the second half of the question?
It was just about the recommended readings.
Oh, all right. Okay. So in the chat box, I put in a piece of my writing that I did a couple of years ago called Critical Climate Justice, that some of this talk today drew from. You're welcome to read that. There's other material. Like I said, you can go to my website. It's my name, farhanasultana.com, and go to the publications tab. But you can also, I would absolutely encourage people to read, for instance, the IPCC chapters. They are scientifically researched. The social science one, I think it's the working group 2, AR6, right? You have a lot of critical social scientists who have pulled together different scholarly work. If you want more radical applied work, you can absolutely find that. There are many different organizations that will put it up on their website in terms of what they're doing. So for instance, in the US, you have indigenous groups who are saying, this is what we're doing. These are the epistemologies or analytical and theoretical frameworks and insights that we're drawing from within indigenous scholarship. Here's the other material we're drawing from, and this is helping inform us, and this is what we're doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Farhana. It was amazing to listen to you, and thank you for answering everyone's questions. Like Dr. Farhana said, her website is available. We'll also link it in the chat box. And thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me, and best of luck for the rest of the event.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marina. Thank you so much, Dr. Sultana. I think I just wanted to give maybe Natalie the opportunity to finish her presentation if she's online. She's been communicating with us that there was a storm in where you are right now, so obviously that have impacted the electricity, but you're welcome to share your screen again. And then we already got, as mentioned before, some great questions, so I would love to ask them to you after you finish your presentation. Thanks.
Great, thank you for having me back, and apologies for the disruption earlier. So I'll just pick up from what I was sharing in as far as what She Changes Climate is planning on the road to COP28. So just aligned with the 3 pillars that I shared earlier, we are, of course, having conversations to have a multi-stakeholder dialogue at COP, and that's very much within the COP space. But over and beyond that, in the lead up to it, in November, we will be having an online summit, which is really just bringing people together in an online space to, sort of bringing COP to people and creating space for conversations, for dialogue, to really understand the COP aspect, what the UNFCCC process is like, just so that there is a lot more knowledge sharing, I would say. So that is one of the things that is happening in the lead up to COP, and I'll share more details just as I conclude. And then finally, we are also sharing stories of women from different parts of the world, primarily the global South, we have a network of ambassadors, and these are mostly young women or youthful women from different parts, from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, from South America, who are doing crucial work in, either rallying, mobilizing communities, or supporting women farmers in areas most affected by drought or floods, and even offering relief sort of measures to people who are impacted by various climate disasters. And so we are amplifying the stories of these ambassadors and telling them like they are. And this really just goes back to what I was saying earlier when I began speaking at the start of the session around language and communication. So one thing that we have definitely picked up over the last year or so is just how important it is to tell stories. Stories are at the core of social impact, of social change. And so telling these stories not in a way that's painting the women as victims, but rather as the solutions that we need at top level. So those are some of the things that we are planning in the lead up to COP and around messaging and communications. So I will also just add as a finality is that when it comes to the policy and advocacy side of things, one of the things that we have taken away, or our lead in policy and advocacy has taken away, is that inclusive framing in how we approach the conversations with current policymakers is so important, because people don't want to feel like their positions are threatened. And so it's really just a strategic tactic to get the conversation going in those boardrooms and negotiation rooms, just to help them understand that it's not, we do need more voices, we need inclusivity, we need diversity. But at the same time, using social media to rally public support. And here's where we've really taken advantage of the various facets of activism, but then also the importance of knowledge sharing. How do we simplify information for the everyday citizen so that they can understand that they too are part of the climate action movement and of She Changes Climate? So I will just end there. Thank you for the opportunity. I will say that you can follow us online at She Climate. You can write to us at hello@shechangesclimate.org. And if you're looking for resources, if you're looking for information, we have a repository on our website that's also displayed on the screen. So Gaia, thank you so much for the opportunity. I don't know if there's any questions. Happy to take if there are.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was amazing. And actually, one of the questions that I was about to ask you was, how can people get involved with She Changes Climate, which you just answered, so that's great. There are a few more questions. I unfortunately think that we only got time to answer the first one that I have here for you. This person quoted you when you said that women are one of the most vulnerable when it comes to climate change. And the question is, in the context of a patriarchal system, how do you talk to men, in inverted commas, about the impacts on women, or climate change impacts on women? And I guess you were also sort of touching on it before when you said about the importance of strategic communication. So it would be great to hear if you could expand on that. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. So I think if I could be very transparent, when it comes to the patriarchal system, you really need to understand how it works and then find your way to get into it. So it's almost like a game of chess, unfortunately, or fortunately, because we're thinking long term. But once you understand, I can give the context of Africa because I'm quite... I understand how patriarchal systems work in most traditional African communities, for instance. And one of the challenges, for instance, here in Western Kenya is an issue of land rights. So women don't have access to land rights. So how do you have the conversations with chiefs, community chiefs who are mostly men, who are always men, religious leaders, for instance, about why women deserve to maybe own land because they are the ones who are responsible for 80% of food production in Africa. And so it's going to them with a sense of understanding that, yes, the systems that they have had pros. However, for them to have more benefit to the community at large, it's important to also have more voices. So not telling them that they should maybe get rid of certain men in their system, but ensure that they have more women as they are continuing to either expand the system or as we just continue moving forward.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful. There is more questions, including one that I just thought some person was wondering about your personal story, because you were talking about the importance of stories, like what inspired you to advocate for climate. We would love to hear that, but we're running a little bit late. So if you were available to answer these questions afterwards, maybe by email, we would love to like share the answers with our participants afterwards.
Yeah, great. And also feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm Natalie Sifuma. I'm more than happy to share my story as a climate advocate and comms person.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Natalie. I'm just gonna give the word to Merna now.
All right, everyone, I'm back with your favorite part of this training, I think, the attendance form. So in a second, you're going to see the typical QR code for our lovely attendance form. You have until, what was it, the 3rd of October to fill it out. Take your time, chill with it. But here it is for everybody asking. Also, of course, it will be sent to you in the follow-up email. So yeah, scan the QR code now, do it later. Just be sure to watch the recording. If you're watching the recording, hi there. And now it's your second favorite time, I think, which is break time in the session. We all need the break, I think, right now to digest everything we just heard. So go grab some water or a cup of tea, pet your cat or your dog, and take 5 minutes off to relax. Come back in 5, though. We still have 2 more incredible speakers to go. See you in a bit.
Welcome back, everyone. I really hope that you had a nice and restful break. Now we are ready to carry on with today's training and to introduce our next speaker. So we're really, really pleased to have here Natalie Aung, who will give us an introduction to climate finance and issues and around access for female or women in general. Natalie Aung is a researcher with a background in environmental policy and law. Her work focuses on designing and delivering climate finance to least developed countries at different levels of governance. She's interested in promoting equitable access to climate finance and supporting community empowerment for climate action. She's worked extensively with diverse stakeholders throughout Southeast Asia to promote evidence-based decision-making and multi-stakeholder participation. She also has experience in policy analysis, using it to understand gender and social equity dimensions of access to natural resources. May, thank you so much for being here today, and I'll let you share your screen and start your presentation. Thanks.
Great, everyone. It's really great to be here, and I'm really impressed and amazed by the stellar questions that you're asking. I'm scared, actually. I'm intimidated by the tough question. So I really want to meet you all. If you could just put in the chat who you are and where you're from, I'd love to know more about you more and engage with you. So I will start sharing my screen. Oops. And I'll talk about climate finance, and hopefully it won't be so boring compared to what some of the other speakers have spoken about. Okay, I think that looks okay.
Yes, perfect, thanks.
All right, great. All right, let's talk about climate finance and how it relates to gender. So with the previous speaker, we heard a lot about climate justice, the landscape of injustice. And climate finance is about the unfair distribution of resources in this landscape of injustice. So just stepping back a bit and talking about the context a little bit, we are in a situation where we have the triple crisis, where we have a crisis of climate, nature, and poverty all combined, and adding pressures on the most marginalized people within society. We also have unjust growth models that Dr. Farhana talked about before that are prioritizing profit over people and well-being of people. We also spoke just now about the power asymmetries and the elite control of resources and the patriarchy that is affecting our day-to-day and preventing the powerless and the underrepresented voices from speaking up. And so within this context, we have unequal resource distribution, particularly around addressing climate change. And so the impact of this unequal resource distribution and a lack of finances to people is that the risks are most borne by the most climate vulnerable communities, which at IIED we call the front lines of climate change. These are local actors that don't have the resources, knowledge to adapt to climate change. So this is the context within which climate finance is operating in. So let me give you a brief overview of what climate finance is. And most of you probably think this is very boring. It seems so technical. It's about finance. And we'll discuss at the end of the session if you still think it's boring. So let me walk you through the definition of climate finance. So there is actually no agreed definition at the international level on what climate finance is, but there are some basic parameters around what it should be. So it is finance or money for adaptation or mitigation to climate change. And under the Paris Agreement, it recognizes this principle of distributive justice, that rich countries that have used a lot of carbon to develop are responsible for giving poorer countries finances and funding towards low carbon development and combat climate change. And so under the Paris Agreement, developed countries are to lead in mobilizing finances to developing countries. And it doesn't say that climate finance should be channeled through a certain instrument. It doesn't say that it should be a grant, that it should be a loan, or any other kind of finance instrument. It just says it can come from a variety of sources, which also means it can come from governments, it can come from the private sector, it can come from banks. So that's the general parameter of what climate finance is. But there are some important elements in Article 9 that talk a bit about the quality of climate finance. And we'll talk more later about the difference between quantity and quality, because I think it's important to think about both when you're talking about climate finance. So in Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, it says that climate finance should be transparent, and that who gives finance, how much should be made available for the public, for people to understand and hold each other accountable. It also talks about access, which we'll talk about more later, that it should be easily and effectively accessed. There also needs to be a balance between adaptation and mitigation. Finance that flows towards adaptation and mitigation needs to be balanced. And we'll talk about the reality of how of what it says here versus how it is currently. And lastly, it says that it should target the most vulnerable countries, especially least developed countries and also small island developing states. Okay. Great to meet you, those that have introduced themselves in the YouTube comments. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we talk about climate finance in a sense of the quality of climate finance and the quantity of climate finance. So easily understood, quantity is how much money is flowing and where to. So in 2009 at COP15, developed countries pledged to reach 100 billion a year by 2020 towards climate finance. And as you can see in this diagram, they didn't really make those goals each year. So in 2013, it was maybe about 60% that they reached the goal. And then by 2020, they made it up to about 80%, but didn't really meet the targets. And you can see in orange that a lot of climate finance came from bilateral donors. So these are governments that are providing money for climate finance. Some sources were also from multilateral development banks, and then there was also money from the private sector. So let's talk a little bit about the finance gaps. And you'll hear a lot of these terms floating around, but basically this is how much is there provided versus how much we actually need. That's what we talk about when we're talking about the gap. So as you can see from this diagram from Climate Policy Initiative, from 2011 to 2020, the actual climate finance was minimal in comparison to how much we think we actually need in order to make it on the 1.5 degree pathway. And these estimates, as you can see, are really huge. We also believe that we've gone beyond the 1.5 degree scenario as well. So we are really in a state of climate crisis. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a gap between adaptation and mitigation financing. So you'll probably have already known about the distinction between adaptation and mitigation, but for a climate finance person, adaptation is something that you can't really make money off, and mitigation is stuff that you can make money off, because this is through renewable energy development, and the private sector is more interested in this. So the UNDP Adaptation Gap Report estimated that you need about $202 billion a year for adaptation alone. And so some figures from Climate Policy Initiative shows that in 2020, between the periods of 2019 to 2020, we had 46 billion on adaptation, and the rest was for mitigation. And while there is increasing amount of funding going towards adaptation, most of the money usually goes to mitigation. In 2020, the total amount of climate finance was 623 billion, but primarily most of it was mitigation. The other challenge with adaptation versus mitigation is that the private sector, like I mentioned, doesn't see an opportunity to make money off of mitigation, so off of adaptation, so they don't finance adaptation. All of the money for adaptation mostly comes from governments and bilateral donors. Okay, let's talk about who is actually reaching them, where the finance is actually going. So as I mentioned before in Article 9, there was a need for effective finance, and then there was also a need to target the most vulnerable countries. And this data from OECD from the periods 2016 to 2019 shows that only about 15.4% of climate finance went to least developed countries, which is tiny. And even less of the money went to SIDS, so 1.5% in 2019. So that's a problem. They're not reaching the commitment that they have of trying to get money to the most vulnerable LDCs and SIDS. And there's some research from IIED in my organization that try to understand how much money is flowing to the most local level, those at the frontiers of climate change, communities, women, local leaders. And we estimate that only, very conservatively estimated, that less than 10% is actually going to local actors. So this is a huge problem. Okay, let's talk a little bit about gender and climate finance as well. So from this diagram, you can see in the purple column, this is total money that went to climate change. And then the blue column is money, the proportion of climate finance that was gender related. You can see from this diagram, the trend is that generally climate finance, money towards climate change is going up, and generally gender considerations in climate finance are also going up a little bit. But the problem is that these are climate projects that have kind of a gender component. So if you look at projects that are primarily gender, addressing gender, it's only about 1.5%. So a lot of climate finance, we can conclude, are not primarily gender. And as we've spoken about a lot today, we need gender to be strongly integrated in climate change initiatives. And I know you guys have a session already about loss and damage. I'll just go over quickly. Loss and damage is like a separate thing that where the estimates of money are huge. We're estimating that developing country damages are as high as 290 to 580 billion a year by 2030. This is taken from the Heinrich Böll Foundation brief on loss and damage. And at COP27, there was a breakthrough where parties decided to establish a loss and damage fund, but we don't really know how much is going to be there, the mechanics of it. And there's also concern that that money is going to be channeled from other sources of climate finance. So is it actually going to be additional to what we already have? Financing for loss and damage can also come from lots of different sources. It can be humanitarian response, development, disaster response, or even climate finance. Okay, so that was stuff about the quantity of climate finance, but we'll talk more about the more fun stuff now on the quality of climate finance. So what do you think it actually means to talk about the quality of climate finance? And these are not things related to the quantity, the amount of money, how much, but it's more about whether the climate finance is actually effective in addressing climate change. So here are some of the issues related to climate finance quality and the problems with it. So one problem straight off the bat is that the money that has been funneled from developed countries is usually funneled through intermediaries. And these are banks, these are international organizations like UN agencies, and they are not the local actors. So the problem with climate finance is that it's being channeled through a very small amount of intermediaries, we call them, that take a lot of money off the top for their fancy offices, fancy salaries, and it doesn't reach the most local actors. So that is a problem with the current climate finance landscape. The other problem we talked about earlier is the issue of access. In Article 9, it says that climate finance should be readily accessible. But the problem is that if you want to get money from a donor, a provider, we call them, it takes a lot of time and money. Have you ever written a grant proposal? It takes ages. You have to do due diligence. You have to write the story of your life and your organization's life. It's really hard to get that money. And you have to do so much reporting to prove that you're not squandering that money. So that's another problem with access. The other problem is that finance is overlooking the drivers of local vulnerability. So not only does climate finance come with preconditions saying, okay, we want this finance to go to building wells in Bangladesh, instead of actually trying to understand whether the local community needs that, whether it is actually going to help them in adaptation, and if it addresses some of the problems that we spoke about before, the structural issues around gender, for example, negative gender norms, uneven power distribution. Does it actually address some of those structural issues? And often it doesn't. The finance is not locally led, means it's not going to local actors, and local actors are not designing the interventions that they need in order to adapt to climate change. And the other problem is that the capabilities are not built. That finance is usually in small amounts over short periods of time. Let's say a project for 1 year for $5,000. That is not going to build long-term capabilities and strengthen the communities for a long period of time. We spoke a little bit about instruments as well. Climate finance, the definition of climate finance as it stands currently doesn't say what kind of instruments it needs to use. And so as you can see from this figure, from the Climate Policy Initiative in purple, most of it is debt. And for many developing countries, I'm from Myanmar, developing countries, we are already knee-deep in debt from other loans, infrastructure, for humanitarian and different development issues. Loans have been taken out, and to take additional loans for climate finance is a huge burden that LDCs insist are not able to repay. Okay, so those are the issues around the quality and quantity of climate finance. Let me give you a very brief introduction on the landscape of public finance. So this is government money, taxpayer money. This is the area that I work most in, so I don't know much about private sector finance. Maybe some of you do. You might have seen this diagram before. At the top are contributors, providers, donors of climate finance. rich countries that have pledged to commit to climate finance, countries like Australia, Canada, Germany, Norway, etc. And they funnel their money through bilateral institutions. You might have heard of CEDA, you might have heard of JICA, depending on the region that you're working in. So they funnel their aid through their dedicated institutions. But that money can also go to the next level, to multilateral institutions. Some of them are under the UNFCCC, which you can see on the left-hand side are UNFCCC financial mechanisms. There's the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, there's the GEF. And there's also a couple of non-UNFCCC financial mechanisms like banks, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, etc. And so these are all entities that are responsible for channeling money. And as we spoke about before, these are intermediaries, and they are the ones primarily taking the money from donor countries and being responsible to distribute it to the local level, to people that are most impacted by climate change. And at the bottom, you'll also see that some of these finances flow to regional and national funds. And you can have a look here: Indonesian Climate Change Trust Fund, South African Grief Fund. These are national climate funds that you might be aware of. Okay, so here is the issue of the intermediaries, at least 3 under the UNFCCC mechanism, and then once the SIF under the MDB system. So you cannot get money from them directly. You have to be accredited through a very, very difficult accreditation process. And referencing back to the problem of access, we want to be able to access, communities should be able to directly access finance so that they can use it within their communities. It goes into their hands. But within this current climate finance system, it's mostly the intermediaries that can access the money from the donor countries. So with the GCF, only accredited entities can access these funds, and it takes a really, really long time and a very difficult process in order to access the funds or become accredited. The Adaptation Fund, there's direct access for national and regional implementing entities, they call them. These are like government departments or banks at the national and regional level, and they can get money, but it doesn't mean the local communities are getting money. The GEF also has UN agencies and multilateral development banks. Only they can access money. And with the SIF, which is a non-UNFCCC mechanism, all that money can only flow through multilateral development banks like Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank. So these are the issues of access. Let me show you quickly why intermediaries are a problem. So this is data for the Green Climate Fund from 2021, and most of the money went to UNDP. And the next is the EBRD, and the third is the World Bank. Another example from GEF, these are the different accredited entities that can directly access money from the GEF, and UNDP, World Bank, UNEP, FAO. They are not local communities. So how do we change the system? I think Dr. Sultana talked a lot about different ways that we can change the system, how we can begin to understand climate justice more within our personal lives, within the communities that we work with. In the climate finance landscape, just a recap of the context that I spoke about earlier, the business as usual is broken. The money is going through intermediaries. There's not enough going to local communities that are at the front lines of climate change. It's very untransparent. You don't know how much is going to whom, and at the next, how much does UNDP give to another intermediary? How much actually gets to the local level? It's quite untransparent. We know that there are lots of different rules and procedures that restrict local communities from accessing climate funds. And climate finance doesn't actually build capabilities at the local level. So what we want to change or move to a business unusual, as we say in IIED, is we want direct finance that goes to the local level. We want it to be transparent. We want access to be simple, sustainable, and flexible. And we want the solutions to be locally led and driven. So these are principles for locally led adaptation that can help you think through what are the important elements of what makes locally led adaptation. So these principles, I won't go through the principles in detail, but they have been very collaboratively developed to define key priorities of what makes locally led, what makes local empowerment. And they cover different aspects of governance, resource distribution, and structural inequality. So, for example, Principle 3 talks about patient and predictable funding. So this is about resources, climate finance, that it should be more accessible, but it should be patient, meaning that local communities should be able to think about what the climate actions should be. And maybe there's a long consultative process in order to define what the climate priorities are. And funding should be able to understand that and meet that need. And predictable, that you know that the money is not going to run out for a project next year, that it should be sustained. So I'll leave you with that, and we can talk more about the principles more if you're interested. And here's another framework that I'll leave you with for thinking about climate finance specifically that can enable locally led action. So principle 1 is on the principle of the subsidiary, that climate finance should be accessible to local actors. Principle 2, that it should be able to address robust climate actions. Principle 3, that it should be predictable from year to year, like we were just talking about. Principle 4 is that it's adaptive, that it's flexible to different external and internal changes. So, for example, if a local organization is really busy and they're not able to deliver on the climate project, that should be understood. If a situation like COVID happens, then the funder should be forgiving and extend the timeline and adapt to the organization's needs. 5, that it should be risk-taking, that it should enable the trialing of innovative approaches. And 6 is that it should enable collaborative action. So I'll leave it at that for now, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, May. That was really, really interesting also to have this sort of other perspective that really connects really well with what the other speakers have said today and will say, because we will see with the other with our next speaker, how this issue of climate maladaptation can also play a massive role in the daily lives of people. We've got lots of questions for you. I'm just a little bit aware of time. I'm going to start with this one to sort of maybe build onto what you said that are the principles to a more effective and just climate financing. What do you believe are the most efficient initiatives? So maybe to go more on the practical side around that are already existing and address the excess gender gap to finances.
Yeah, there are a lot of funders already that are experimenting with different approaches. One fund off the top of my head is called the Pawanka Fund. It's a fund for Indigenous people, and it directly finances community, but it's invitation only. So it's Indigenous leaders that are on the board, and they work with communities collaboratively in order to find what it is that they need. It's flexible, it adjusts to the local context, and there are also a couple of other approaches at different levels. So in Nepal, there is an initiative that's trying to funnel at the national level more directly to a local level. And they are trying different consultative ways of incorporating local voices, local needs around climate change. So locally led adaptation looks different, and innovations are happening at different scales. We have some publications that looks at good examples of financing that I can share.
That would be amazing. And also a reminder to all participants that the very informative slides that May just talked with, are already available actually in the shared folder that we shared before and after the session via email. So you can consult that, and then we'll be pleased to share any additional resources that you may have, May, as well as mentioned before, circulate the other questions that you received today. And I just believe we don't really have the time to address right now, but thank you so much once again for your great intervention, and for being with us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And now I'm gonna pass the word to Myrna one more time.
All right. Hi again, everyone, and hope you're enjoying the session so far. I definitely am. I love this topic so much. So our last but certainly not least amazing speaker of the day is Reetika Subramanian, who will be discussing gender and climate maladaptation and the relationship between climate change and early marriage. Reetika is a final year PhD candidate and Gates Cambridge Scholar at the University of Cambridge Center for Gender Studies. She spent over a decade working as a journalist and researcher. Her work primarily straddles the areas of gender-based violence, labor migration, and climate adaptation in South Asia. She's the founder and host of the Climate Brides podcast, co-author of the multilingual comic book Raindrop in the Drought, Godavari Dange, and the co-converter of the Grammars of Marriage and Desire Research Network, and the Women and Development Study Group. In recognition of her outstanding research and leadership, she has won multiple accolades, including the Bill Gates Senior Prize in 2022, Movements and Moments Feminist Generations Grant in 2021, Bell Scholar Prize in 2017, and the Chevening Award in 2016. Reetika, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I think I'm not able to share. Okay, I can share my screen. Okay, just a minute. Okay, so hello, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this session. I think it's good to present at the end, especially given that there's already so much context that has been set. So by now, I'm sure you'd agree with me when I say that climate change is not gender neutral, and the experiences are further amplified by who you are, where you live, what ethnicity you belong to, or what class position you may hold. In my presentation, I'm going to extend this lens of gender to examine age, particularly adolescents and youth, in a climate changing world. In other words, how do young women and girls, particularly from historically oppressed communities, experience and adapt to rising temperatures, unpredictable rainfall, and plummeting water tables? And more specifically, as the title of my presentation suggests, what are the ways in which climate change is driving an entire generation of underage brides in ecologically vulnerable hotspots of the world? Before I move ahead, I'd just like to acknowledge that all the illustrations that you'll see as part of this presentation have been created by Maitri Dore for the Climate Brides podcast. Right. Now I'd like to start my presentation by quoting a line from a very thought-provoking paper on gender, climate change, and agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. I've tweaked it a little to include girls as well, and the quote helps to situate the importance and role of nearly half the world's population in climate change and adaptation research and policy. So a simplistic victim narrative isn't enough. We need a more nuanced and realistic view of women and girls as key actors in the construction of knowledge about their experiences, acknowledge their work in ensuring the everyday survival of the household, their relationships with other stakeholders, and their own bargaining and negotiation skills. So using this framework to place young women and girls at the very center of climate change adaptation discourse, I will quickly walk you through my presentation. So I have divided it into 3 key sections, beginning with a broad overview of gender, girlhood, and climate change. I will then move on to the role of climate change in driving early marriage decisions in households located in South Asia's climate hotspots. For some of you, it may seem like 2 very disconnected realities or possibilities, but I will try to establish some links by drawing on my experiences as a journalist and ethnographer in India, as well as the conversations we've been recording with frontline workers, academics, journalists, and community leaders as part of the Climate Brights podcast that I host. And in the end, I'm going to focus on a case study from a historically drought-affected region in Western India called Marathwada to see how early marriages are fixed and practiced among marginalized and landless communities who migrate to work in sugarcane fields. This 3rd section is based on my own PhD research, and my focus here will be to get into the specific details of the practice by discussing marriage payments, labor arrangements, and how there's a market designed to absorb young wife workers coming from the dry and arid region. Right. So first we'll talk about the gender, girlhood, and climate relationships. So this slide, in a way, offers a quick recap of what we've actually been discussing in this session so far. Climate change functions as a threat multiplier, wherein it perpetuates or aggravates pre-existing socioeconomic vulnerabilities, exclusions, and everyday risks. So in India, for instance, members of the Dalit community are more vulnerable to both natural and climatic disasters compared to dominant upper caste populations due to their marginalized social position. For instance, they live in the village outskirts, they hold temporary informal labor jobs, and reside in makeshift houses. Now, they own little to no land. So this means that in the event of a typhoon, a flood, or a drought, they have less access to the amenities and information of administrative centers and experience increased labor burdens. And like we have been discussing so far, climate change is not gender neutral. And one missing aspect in this conversation is the particular experience of girls. Now, while we do have youth climate activists such as Greta, Leah, Nadia, Patricia, Vanessa, Ridhima, and I'm sure many among you who have already hit the streets, there's still not enough discussion about the young women and girls who are already experiencing the effects of a warmer world in the present, here, and today. For one, adolescence has a relatively short history, both as a recognized stage in the lifespan of girls and as a subject of research. Sandwiched in between the fields of feminist and childhood studies, girlhood by itself is pushed under layers of invisibility in a complex network of social processes and human relations. Second, there is limited availability of disaggregated and contextually embedded research and recorded data sets. Third, there is a serious lack of robust scientific data to measure the impacts of climate change on young women's and girls' lives. And this gap in global research and evidence risks leaving girls and community voices out of the programs and policies that must protect them in the first place. Now, young women and adolescent girls face a double jeopardy because of their gender and age. These inequalities are produced out of everyday practices related to access to resources, divisions of work, and cultural norms around mobility and decision-making. So for instance, following the 2007 cyclone Sidr in Bangladesh, schools were used as emergency shelters, meaning they stayed closed for months after the cyclone hit. And the government of Bangladesh reported a high dropout rate following the cyclone. Similarly, the devastating 2010 and 2022 floods of Pakistan destroyed an estimated over 10,000 schools. And once schools reopened, fewer girls re-enrolled than boys. Now, these dropouts are also linked to prevailing gender norms, wherein early on, girls are initiated into the world of work. They have to help their mothers and other women in the household to fetch water, fuel, and other resources. And this labor gets heightened during an extreme weather event, often at the expense of schooling. Similarly, lack of menstrual health products and period stigma keeps millions of girls out of school, and menstrual health becomes an even more pressing issue with climate change. In fact, menstruation is a taboo, and living in shelters and relief camps in the aftermath of a cyclone or flash floods in a very confined space with many families is a nightmare. It also makes them more vulnerable to sexual violence and the possibilities of forced and early marriages. And this brings me to the second section of this presentation, in which I look at the role and function of early marriage as a means of maladaptation to climate change. So I mainly draw on the work of the Climate Brides project that I set up in 2021 to document a more context-specific, nuanced, and ground-up link between climate change and early marriage in South Asia. Now, South Asia has the highest rate of early and forced marriages in the world, and its climate change vulnerability has long been apparent. Nearly 1 in 5 girls are married before the age of 15, and over 750 million people, which is half the region's population, were affected by one or more climate-related disasters in the past decade. Now, the cyclones of Bangladesh, blistering heat waves in India, the tsunami in Sri Lanka, the floods in Pakistan have demonstrated how climate change intersects with and increases existing inequalities of gender, ethnicity, and class. So from increased labor for obtaining water, fuel, and food for their families, rising cases of ethnic and gendered violence, including sexual violence, sexual abuse, and rape in the wake of disaster, to additional challenges to accessing assistance and humanitarian aid during disasters, research, news reports, and even community-run organizations suggest that marrying off a minor daughter during a climate-related disaster can often mean that there is one less mouth to feed. And the links between early marriage and the climate crisis are thus complex, dynamic, but yet seemingly irrefutable. Now, there are 2 particular cases I'd like to highlight here based on episodes we've recorded on the Climate Brides podcast. First, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and earthquake, which is also known as the Boxing Day tsunami, killed more than 230,000 people across 14 countries. Within minutes, buildings crumbled like a pack of cards, trees and cars were swept away, and virtually no one caught in the deluge survived. And in the aftermath, infrastructure conditions in the tsunami relief camps reportedly exposed women and girls to increased sexual violence. Long ways to toilets and showers, unlit streets to fetch water, and half-open tents as homes rendered them more vulnerable. Now, anecdotal evidence recorded by relief and aid organizations revealed that minor girls in Sri Lanka, for instance, were reportedly forced into marriages with tsunami widowers, and in many instances did so to receive state subsidies for marrying and starting a family. In many villages of South India, young girls whose parents or fathers had died were being forced into early marriages. They were married off within their extended families or to money lenders as a means to pay off family debts. People living in the camps also thought it was safer to marry their younger daughters off to even older men rather than risk them getting raped. The second is the custom of toina, or bride price, that is prevalent in Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan is among the most climate vulnerable countries in the world due to its geography, sensitivity to changing weather patterns, and an infrastructure unable to cope with global warming. There has been relatively little attention paid to climate change in Afghanistan, where the majority of Afghans are farmers or earn an income from agriculture, and where the United Nations Environment Programme estimates 80% of conflict is over land, water, and resources. Now, displaced by droughts, families in the relief camps are facing extreme poverty and starvation. Now, under these circumstances, the toina plays a key role. In exchange for a sack full of grains, cattle, and money, families are giving their daughters as young as 8 and 9 years to men over twice their age in exchange. Even here, marriage is part of the family's survival strategy, and climate change is amplifying existing insecurities and inequalities. I will now move on to the final section of my presentation, where I'll talk briefly about my ongoing doctoral research, which is set against the backdrop of cyclical drought and industrialized agriculture in Western India. And I will focus on the practice of gate cane weddings that are fairly popular in the region to cope with drought and find a livelihood. Right. Now, the research is situated in the epicenter of India's agrarian crisis, known as Marathwada, the region that is marked in the shade of brown on the map. And ironically, Marathwada is located in India's richest province, Maharashtra. Now, the region marked in green in Western Maharashtra is called the Desh region. Now, Marathwada itself is spread across 8 districts, and it has a long history of droughts. What has changed dramatically in recent times is their frequency and intensity. So from once in 5 years in the second half of the 20th century, there has been practically one continuous drought since the turn of the millennium, with just a few years scattered in between. Now, apart from poor rainfall, there has been another key actor that has been defining Marathwada's drought, which is sugar. Sugarcane has been controlling the politics of Maharashtra since the late 1960s, a period that also coincides with the onset of the worst cyclical droughts recorded in Marathwada's history. Now, I would like to bring attention to the fact that sugarcane is a huge water-guzzling crop. Now, I'm not going into the details right now, but Marathwada's water crisis began in the 1980s, almost concurrently with the expansion of sugarcane monocropping, particularly in the Desh region, the green section on the map. Now, in the past 10 years, there has again been a record statewide push for industrialized sugarcane cultivation among the large land-owning farmers, including within drought-hit pockets of Marathwada. And this has fueled large-scale dispossession and displacement. Now, ironically, the key means of survival adaptation to this crisis is offered by, well, sugarcane. Over 1 million marginal farmers and landless populations have turned into migrant laborers, particularly from the Dalit and Banjara families. Every year, they migrate to neighboring regions from Marathwada, particularly to Desh region, to work as sugarcane harvesters. The excess availability of cheap and vulnerable labor on the one hand, and the excess production of cane on the other, have led to peculiar work arrangements. So typically, a labor contractor recruits a married couple as a single unit known as a koita. Koita literally translates to a sickle. Now, the couple is expected to work together. The husband, as the male worker, cuts the cane. The wife, as the female partner, ties up the stalks. The female partner is also responsible for, of course, the domestic work in the temporary house that they hold in the cane farms. Now, although the female labor participation rate is high in the sugar industry, given the arrangement, it is really difficult for women to join the supply chain without a male relative. The wage too is calculated and paid to the husband as a koita, as a unit, rather than to individual workers. So under these circumstances, where marriage has become a part of the labor arrangement, Marathwada has been witnessing a dynamic process of socio-political restructuring. There is a sharp rise in early marriages in the region. In Beed district, the largest hub for hiring sugarcane workers, and also a region which is regarded as extremely drought-prone, government data shows that nearly 44% of women aged 20 to 24 years had been married before turning 18, which is the legal age at marriage. And this is twice the percentage of underage marriages recorded in Maharashtra and India. Incidentally, even as early marriage rates have dropped in the country over the years because of stricter laws, civil society and policy interventions, the current percentage of underage marriages in Beed district is on par with those reported in India and Maharashtra back in the 1990s. Since 2010, when the region has been affected by more frequent droughts, local journalists and grassroots activists have also reported a 20% rise in early marriages. So I found that the increased uncertainty brought about by poor rainfall, lowering water tables, and loss of local livelihoods, as well as the existence of the sugarcane economy that depends on such cheap labor, have rendered early marriage to not just be a key means of adaptation in Marathwada, but also as a key means of recruitment. And with marriage, a young girl turns into a wife and worker. Now, I'll go into some detail about the specificities of this marriage labor arrangement. And as mentioned earlier, within the Koita arrangement, the husband and wife are recruited as a couple, where the husband cuts the cane and the wife ties up the stalks and also manages the, cooking, cleaning, fetching water, fetching fuel wood, childcare, amongst other things. Now, locally, marriages to form Koitas have been institutionalized as gate cane lagna or gate cane weddings. Such weddings are fixed either in the run-up to the sugarcane harvest season or even solemnized on the fields. The objectives of the arrangement are fairly clear: to find a suitable bride or groom, cut down on wedding costs and dowry, and fix a new Koita as quickly as possible, sometimes even within hours. Most gate cane weddings involved underage brides and grooms. Now, there are two monetary systems that fuel this arrangement. The first is the utsal, which are advance cash payments given in lump sum that the labor contractor offers to the Koita before the cane harvest season. And this cane harvest season sort of coincides with the peak summer months in Marathwada region. Accordingly, the Koita's wage is deducted from the advance on a per tonnage basis on the amount of cane that they cut, which most often adds up to a below minimum daily wage. And it is impossible for them to work for the whole amount in one harvest, which means that the pending utsal or the advance payment turns into a high interest loan, which is carried over to the next season. The second connected system is called hunda, which is a form of dowry, in which the bride's family is socially mandated to give the groom's family money and other material goods at the time of the wedding. Now, typically, younger brides incur lower hundas. These payments and wedding expenses are covered by the bride's family through more debt, often including a higher advance payment from the labor contractor that they can repay only over several harvests. And with a new bride in the house and limited local livelihoods, the groom's family forms a new Koita by taking on a new advance payment, and that's how the cycle continues. So drought, migration patterns, and extractive work arrangements with limited access to healthcare and sanitation have unleashed some serious problems, particularly among the young women and girls from the region. So for instance, in 2019, Beed district hit the news headlines when reports emerged of an unusually high rate of hysterectomies among sugarcane harvesters, including young women. So a state government report identified early marriages, lack of toilets, increased labor burdens, and the possibility of losing pay during menstruation as some of the key reasons. What is fairly clear in the case of Marathwada, as well as in Renuka Pawar's quote here, is that in the absence of any government records on early marriages and number of migrants, limited access to higher secondary schools in the village, and no recognition by the state or the industry, either of the young women and girls as workers or key stakeholders, the cycles of drought, food insecurity, loss of livelihoods, and debt will continue on the one hand, while the sugarcane industry prospers on the other. Early marriage, while it is used by families as a way to cope and survive, as a survival strategy for the household, even as sugarcane factory owners have actually co-opted it as a way to find more labor units to harvest more cane. I'd like to finally end with a few thoughts on moving forward. There is a need, as we've all been speaking about over the past 2 hours, for contextually embedded and a disaggregated approach, wherein research, aid, and provisioning for gender and age-responsive policy and programs are undertaken, keeping in mind the diversity and the differences. As is clear from my presentation as well, the realities in Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, India, and Bangladesh, which all belong to the same region, are in fact quite different and quite particular. Young women and girls as key stakeholders need to be recruited as key stakeholders and acknowledged as key stakeholders. We need to reflect on the social and structural barriers and work towards ensuring that we are able to uphold girls' rights and provide for social protection. We need to develop a multidimensional, multi-sectoral approach for girls to freely and safely access schools, judicial systems, as well as health centers. And we need to keep, most importantly, gender and girlhood at the heart and center of climate relief, climate adaptation, policy, and longer-term sustainable development initiatives. And most crucially, we need to learn from communal knowledge systems and factor in women's and girls' experiences and insights. And because as primary users, they hold unique ways of thinking and understanding their environments and needs. Finally, thank you very much. To learn more about this work, please follow the Climate Brights project on social media. Tune into the episodes wherever you hear your podcasts, and please do get in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Reetika. This was so interesting to listen to, especially this topic is something that I've worked on and I'm very invested in it. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll only have time to ask one question, which is, what can we do to raise awareness that young girls are not a tool for exchange when their families are facing financial instability and think that by doing this, they're killing two birds with one stone?
Right. I think that's at the very heart and center of, the kind of issue that we're talking about today. And I think one major issue, like what I was trying to even do through this presentation, is actually look at the structural barriers at work, like during the course of field work or during the course of the conversations I've been having as part of the podcast as well. One thing is clear, that given the choice, it is not something wherein, there's one thing I remember wherein a young bride told me that, it's not like her mother doesn't love her enough, but it's just because of the considerations at that point, which are coming from economic insecurity, which are coming from ecological crisis. It becomes very, very important to ensure that we are able to, recognize these barriers. So I think these structural barriers, the structural gaps. So I think one thing that we need to do is sort of hold the state accountable. We need to sort of see the ways in which we're able to look also from the ground up while thinking of, what is going on, especially thinking of what are the gaps that need to be filled. So a ground up approach is useful, but at the same time, a top down approach is necessary when we're thinking about interventions in terms of policy change, in terms of also ensuring that we have, for example, schools, we're able to think of it from a more multi-sectoral approach. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being here. I'll hand over to Gaia to close out now.
Thank you so much, Myrna, and thank you so much, Reetika. That was fascinating. I invite you to have a look at the YouTube link as well, because there are some great comments flowing there as well, just appreciating the presentation. And as always, we can share some of the other questions online afterwards. So just to close off, we got the attendance form. Once again, I'm just gonna paste it in the chat as well. So make sure that you click on that here or in the next couple of weeks. And I also wanted to show you in the next slide that what the next session is going to be about. It's going to be about climate change from a nature perspective, and we are going to hear from some amazing speakers, very diverse. The session will look at the intersection between climate change and biodiversity conservation. We'll discuss the relationship between climate biodiversity conservation and the UNFCCC COPs, the importance of nature-based solutions, and a critical lens on their framing, as well as an overview of the intersection between nature-based solutions and indigenous rights. We're going to hear from Audrey Wagner, who's a program coordinator of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiatives at the University of Oxford, Dr. June Rubis, Director of Research at the Building Indigenous Initiatives in Heritage Sarawak Initiative and an environmental conservationist, and then Mirna Fernandez, who is an environmental engineer and member of the steering committee for the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. So very exciting for next session. And just to close, we're also going to share a few useful links that hopefully are kind of familiar by now. So the first one is our Terra partnership that, as always, we remind you to join, because there are some great additional learning resources that joining is really easy. You can just sign up to their website using the same email address that you used to sign up for this training. And then something else that is always worth to remember is to please join us on Slack. We've got a very lively community going on there. You can just like interact with other participants, get to know what everybody's up to in their lives and in their interest for climate change. I'm just going to close by remembering and sort of like appreciating that fact that this course was made possible by the generous contributions or the funders that you can see now on the screen, and our great partners, eco-interpreters, that as always ensure that we get our message as wide as possible in four different languages. So yes, we can't wait to see you in a couple of weeks' time for the next session, and I'm just now gonna say goodbye. thank you so much for this great session and for being with us till the end.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.